The night he found it, the temperature had already dropped to 9 degrees. He almost didn't stop, almost. There are moments in a person's life that arrive without warning, small forks in the road disguised as nothing more than a flicker of movement beneath a street lamp. This was one of those moments, and what happened next would quietly change everything he thought he understood, about instinct, about wildness, and about the strange unspoken language that exists between creatures who were never supposed to meet. It was just past 7 in the evening when Marcus turned off the highway onto the long rural road that led home. The kind of cold that had settled over Vermont that January wasn't the polite kind. It was the kind that cracked tree bark and froze pipes and made grown men move fast from car to door without looking up. His headlights swept across the tree line, across the frost-pale gravel, and then, for just a second, caught something beneath the old street lamp at the edge of his property. He braked slowly, leaned forward over the steering wheel. A small shape, motionless, curled tight against the base of the post as if the lamp's cold metal might offer some warmth that the world had otherwise withdrawn. He told himself it was a stray. There were always strays out this way. Cats that wandered from neighboring farms found themselves turned around in the cold, ended up on someone's porch by morning. He pulled to the shoulder, left the engine running, and walked toward it with the careful, unhurried steps of a man who had learned that frightened animals needed time. But when he crouched down and the light fell across the small body, he stopped breathing for a moment. The coat was spotted, not the soft tabby stripes of a barn cat, actual spots, dark and deliberate against tawny fur. The ears were tipped with fine dark tufts. The paws, even curled and trembling, were wide in a way that no house cat's paws ever were. He reached out one gloved hand and gently turned the animal's face toward the light. A bobcat kitten, barely 8 weeks old by the look of it, alone, hypothermic, and somewhere past the edge of what a body that small could survive much longer. He didn't think. He unzipped his coat, wrapped the kitten against his chest, zipped it back up and walked to the car. The next 2 hours were methodical and quiet. Marcus had spent 20 years as a field technician for a forestry survey team. He wasn't a veterinarian, but he knew cold, and he knew the difference between an animal that had given up and one that was simply waiting for a reason to keep going. He filled 2 hot water bottles, wrapped them in towels, and nestled the kitten between them on the bathroom floor. He warmed a shallow dish of water to body temperature and touched a dropper of it to the kitten's lips every few minutes until it began to swallow on its own. He kept the lights low. He kept his voice low. He worked the way a person works when they understand that stillness is a form of kindness. At some point around 10 o'clock, the kitten's shivering began to ease. Its breathing, which had been shallow and erratic, found a slower, more committed rhythm. Marcus sat back against the wall with his knees up and watched it. He told himself, quietly and with some conviction, that this was a one-night arrangement, that in the morning he would call the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, or the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center over in Montpelier, and they would take it from there. He had done his part. He had done more than most people would have. He told himself that several more times before midnight. He had forgotten, in the focus of the emergency, about Milo. Milo was 11 years old, a gray and white domestic shorthair with one permanently bent ear and the calm, unbothered temperament of a cat who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. He had been asleep on the armchair in the living room when Marcus came in, and he had remained there watchful and patient while Marcus moved back and forth from bathroom to kitchen and back again. But sometime after midnight, when the house had gone quiet, and Marcus had dozed off against the bathroom wall, Milo came to investigate. Marcus woke to a soft sound, not alarming, not urgent, just the particular silence that follows movement. He opened his eyes to find Milo standing at the bathroom doorway, studying the small spotted shape on the towels with the focused, unreadable attention that cats reserve for things that genuinely puzzle them. He expected hissing. He tensed, ready to intervene. Milo walked forward slowly, lowered his nose to the kitten's face, and inhaled for a long moment. Then, with the quiet deliberateness of someone making a decision they have already thought through completely, he began to groom the top of the bobcat's frozen ears. Marcus didn't move, didn't speak. The kitten stirred, faintly, the way sleeping things stir when something warm and steady reaches them, and made a sound so small it was barely a sound at all. Milo continued, stroke after slow stroke, working the cold from fur that had no business being indoors, caring for something the world had left behind in the dark. Marcus sat in the doorway of his own bathroom at midnight on the coldest night of the year, watching a house cat tend to a wild thing, and felt, without being able to explain it, that something had just been decided that was no longer entirely up to him. He had set an alarm for 7. By the time it went off, the decision had already been made for him. Marcus found them in the bathroom just as he'd left them, except now Milo was curled completely around the bobcat kitten, chin resting over its back, one paw draped across its side like an arm. The kitten's breathing was steady and full. Its tiny spotted paws flexed slowly against the towel, testing the feeling of being warm again, as if it was remembering something it had almost forgotten for good. Marcus stood in the doorway with his coffee and watched for a long moment before reaching for his phone. The wildlife center was kind but honest. They were at capacity. A hard winter had filled every kennel, and unless the animal was in critical condition, they asked if he could manage a few more days. They would send care instructions by email. He said yes before he'd fully thought it through. Those few days became a week. The week became 2. The kitten, whom Marcus never officially named, though he privately began calling him Scout, graduated from warm towels to a proper padded crate, then to cautious wobbling laps around the bathroom floor. He ate with surprising hunger. He slept with surprising trust, and through every stage of it, Milo was there, bringing a toy mouse to the crate door, meowing with pointed concern whenever Scout cried, and curling around him each night with the patient dedication of someone who had accepted a responsibility and intended to honor it. Marcus tried separating them once, gently moving Milo to the living room and closing the hallway door. Within 10 minutes, Milo had hooked his paw under the gap, worked it open and was back beside the crate without any apparent sense of drama about it. Marcus didn't try again. By the end of the second week, Scout was eating solid food, raw chicken cut small, and testing his legs with a new confidence. He chewed the corner of a cabinet. He pounced on shadows. He scaled the side of the bathroom cabinet with small, precise movements that had nothing domestic in them whatsoever. But every evening, without fail, he pressed his forehead against Milo's and stayed there. Marcus watched it all with the quiet attention of a man who had spent his career observing nature and had learned to recognize when something real was happening. This wasn't instinct running on autopilot. This was something chosen, on both sides, in whatever wordless way animals choose things. He stopped checking the wildlife center's number quite so often after that. Spring came early that year, and Scout came with it. By March, the kitten that Marcus had carried home against his chest was something else entirely. The spotted coat had deepened. The paws, always too large for the rest of him, finally had a body to match. When Scout moved through the house now, furniture shifted. Lamps required relocating. The cabinet he had once chewed on now bore deep, clean scratch marks that went straight through the paint. He was not dangerous, but he was no longer small. Marcus had built an outdoor enclosure along the side yard, 12 feet high, wrapped in reinforced wire, furnished with climbing platforms and fallen logs. Scout took to it immediately. He stalked beetles through the grass with a focus that was ancient and unhurried. He climbed to the highest platform and sat facing the tree line, reading the wind with his nose in long, slow pulls. He was practicing something, remembering something, and every evening he pressed against the glass door and looked inside for Milo. The call from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center came on a Tuesday. A field biologist named Karen had reviewed Scout's weight, behavior notes, and age. Her assessment was clear. He was healthy, fully developed, and had a strong window for successful wild reintegration. Waiting longer would only narrow it. Marcus thanked her and set the phone down on the kitchen counter. Milo jumped up beside it and sat looking at him. There was no version of this decision that felt clean. Scout belonged to the forest in a way that no amount of warmth or affection could honestly override. Marcus understood that, had always understood it, from the moment he'd seen those spotted markings beneath the street lamp. Keeping a wild animal past the point of its readiness wasn't love. It was something smaller than love, dressed up to look like it. But Milo didn't know any of that. Milo knew that every morning Scout was there, and every evening Scout pressed his forehead to the glass, and that the space between them had become something he organized his days around. That night Marcus sat on the back step and watched Scout move through the enclosure in the dark. He moved without hesitation now, fluid, purposeful, already more wilderness than window. The tree line beyond the fence stood black against a pale sky. Scout paused at the far edge of the enclosure, lifted his nose to the air, and held perfectly still for a long moment. Then he turned, walked back across the yard, and pressed his face against the glass where Milo was waiting. Marcus exhaled slowly. He had maybe a week left to decide, but watching them then, he understood the decision had already found its shape. Quiet, painful, and right. The morning of the release was cold and bright, the way spring mornings sometimes are in Vermont. All light and no warmth yet, the sky a clean pale blue above the tree line. Karen and her colleague arrived at 9. They moved quietly, professionally, with the practiced calm of people who understood that these moments deserved a certain kind of stillness. Marcus had already opened the enclosure gate. Scout stood at the far end of it, reading the open air beyond the fence with that long, slow attention that had become so familiar. Marcus let Milo out on his leash, something he rarely did, but today felt necessary. Scout turned at the sound of him, crossed the enclosure in several unhurried strides. He lowered his broad head and pressed it firmly against Milo's the way he had done 100 times through glass and wire. Milo closed his eyes. Neither of them moved for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually do. Then Scout straightened, turned toward the open gate, and walked into the forest without looking back. The house was too quiet for weeks. Milo moved through it differently, slower, more deliberate, pausing in doorways as if recalibrating. He checked the enclosure each morning from the kitchen window. He slept longer than usual. He didn't stop eating or playing, but something in him had receded to a place Marcus couldn't reach. Marcus gave him time. It was all there was to give. 6 weeks after the release, Marcus pulled the memory card from the trail camera he'd mounted at the tree line. He almost didn't check it that evening. It had become a quiet ritual with diminishing returns, more habit than hope. He plugged it in at the kitchen table. The footage was mostly wind-shifted branches and a fox passing at 2 in the morning. And then, 53 minutes after midnight on a Thursday, the camera's motion sensor triggered. Scout stepped into frame at the edge of the trees, bigger now, broader through the chest, heavier in his movement, undeniably wild in a way that the enclosure had only suggested. He stood at the tree line, and looked toward the house with the same steady, unhurried attention he had always given to things that mattered to him. The audio was faint but clear. From the porch, Milo's soft, repeated cry, and then, twice, close together, a low sound from the tree line in response. Marcus watched the clip 4 times without speaking. The following evening, he opened the back door at dusk. Scout didn't come fully into the yard, but he came close enough for Milo to walk to the edge of the porch steps and touch his nose to Scout's before the forest reclaimed him again. Marcus stood in the doorway and let it be what it was. Not a rescue story, not a wild animal tamed or a pet lost. Something rarer and quieter than either, a bond that had asked nothing of the world except to be honored, and somehow, against considerable odds had been. He had told himself one night, just one night, some nights, it turns out, don't end. They simply change shape, and keep returning, on their own terms to remind you that the things you almost didn't stop for are sometimes exactly what you were meant to find.